From Genesis 3 to Genesis 6, the authors recount the degradation of humanity. The sin of Adam and Eve multiplies throughout their descendants. Oppression, violence, and corruption fill the earth. God, seeing where this is headed, must do something to prevent things from getting even worse. And so God passes judgment upon mankind and offers a new start through one man. Genesis 6:5 begins by echoing verse 1, where it reads that man multiplied on the face of the land. Robert Alter notes the adjective of verse 5 could be read as a verb, and thus would echo the effect of verse 1. Man multiplied on the face of the earth, and now evil has multiplied on the face of the earth. God's response in verse 6 has caused a great deal of confusion for many readers, because in modern translations, it reads that God regretted or was sorry he made mankind. And this would imply God made a mistake or was unaware of the future beforehand. But we have to remember this verse was not written in modern English, and the Hebrew verse contains interpretive problems. The word for regret has been difficult to translate. John Walton suggests there is no English word that can readily capture the meaning of the Hebrew word. For example, in Genesis 24:67, it refers to Isaac being comforted for mourning the loss of his mother. In Genesis 27:42, it refers to Esau planning to kill Jacob. In Deuteronomy 32:36, it refers to having compassion. And in Judges 2:18, it refers to God moving to feel pity for his people. In fact, modern translations and the Septuagint can translate this word in up to 10 different ways, signifying the interpretive problems with this word. Kenneth Mathews reminds us the verse contains parallelism. The first clause is meant to parallel the second clause, that it grieved him in his heart. Robert Alter also notes the word for grieved has the same verbal root that reflects Eve's mental anguish of Genesis 3. Thus, commentators have noted the implication here is that God was deeply saddened by the actions of mankind. But the first part of the verse indicates that God also needed to act. Walton says, it simply suggests that his action is motivated by his sense of justice as he weighs the situation. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. In other words, God was deeply saddened in reviewing the situation, and justice had to be executed before humanity caused even more damage. The interesting thing about this account is the main driving force for the flood is God's sadness. In other ancient Near Eastern flood accounts, the gods become angry with humanity, which causes them to bring about the flood. In these accounts, the flood is brought about with anger. In Genesis, the flood is brought about with sadness. It is not something God wanted, but because he cares for justice, it must be done. Genesis is an account, not of an angry or malicious God, but of a grieving God. However, the authors then tell us this is not the end, because a small sliver of hope was found. The text tells us of Noah, who is called righteous and blameless as compared with the rest of his generation that had become corrupt. He is also seen as a new Adam, someone who walks with God and mediates a covenant between humanity and God. But also, both are blessed, endowed with special roles, told to be fruitful and multiply. Both are caretakers of animals, and both have 3 sons highlighted, with one falling out of grace. Both are workers of the ground, and both have sins connected to fruit. Adam was brought animals to be named, and Noah was brought animals to be placed into the ark. Both are placed in a covenantal role. Adam was established as priest over creation, and placed in a garden to commune with God. Noah was told God would establish a covenant with him, and then he is told to enter the ark. And then after, God promises no additional curses on the ground, placed there because of Adam. Nahum Sarna says, in the Bible, Noah's birth is represented in the genealogical list as the first after Adam's death. This reinforces the notion of Noah as the second father of mankind, and emphasizes the idea of the immediate post-diluvial period as a new beginning to life on earth. The covenant between man and God symbolizes, furthermore, a new relationship between the deity and his world. Noah's Ark is thus the matrix of a new creation. Noah is also seen as a prototype of Moses. Both mediate between God and humanity in a covenantal role. Both sacrifice clean animals, commune with God in a close way. Both were delivered by a teba, the same word for the ark, in the basket Moses was placed in as an infant. Both have signs for the established covenant, and both did their assigned tasks of building the ark and the tabernacle, according to all that the Lord had commanded. Thus God elects Noah like he did with Adam, and will later do with Moses, as a mediator between him and the rest of humanity. God states that because of Noah's status as a righteous man, he will spare Noah and his family from the coming judgment, and establish a covenant with him. Genesis 6 is written in a covenantal structure. Noah must do certain things in order to enact the new covenant between God and the creatures of the earth, that he will mediate for. To enact this, God instructs him to do several things in preparation. He must build an ark to a specific size, so that it can include enough space for his family, 2 of every animal, as well as 7 pairs of every bird and every clean animal, and of course food for the trip. Meredith Kline says, Genesis 6:18 comes within the first of the 7 sections. This section has a command fulfillment pattern. Thus the Lord, disclosing his judicial purpose, instructs Noah as to the role he must perform, and Noah obediently carries out the assignment. The divine commissioning of Noah is divided into 2 balancing parts, verse 13 to 16 and verses 17 to 21. Each of these begins with a statement of God's intention to destroy all flesh from the earth. This is followed in each case by the actual directives. In the first part, the instructions deal with the construction of the ark. In the second part, with the ark's occupants and provisioning. This is not too different than what happens at Sinai. In order for Israel to begin its new covenant with God, mediated by Moses, certain actions must be performed for Israel to express their commitment to God. When a Christian enters a covenant with Christ, he or she performs baptism to ceremonially pronounce they have entered into a covenant with God. Likewise, Noah was given specific commands to fulfill in preparation so the new covenant can be established later between creation and God. Because of this, the flood account is best understood in terms of a covenant God is preparing to establish, and what Noah does is in relation to preparing the way for a new covenant between God and creation, and with him as the mediator. We have to remember, this is the main aim of the text, not global catastrophe. Now later texts refer to Noah as a herald of righteousness, and that the act of building the ark was seen as condemning his generation. Noah is later painted as a prophet of his time, pronouncing judgment, and doing so by building the ark. However, Genesis 6 or 7 doesn't explicitly state any of this, but there may be an indication in the text that Noah was acting like a prophet for his generation, which is what the later authors were referring to. Much debate has been given to the act of bringing animals onto the ark. Global flood proponents use this as evidence the flood covered the whole earth. Otherwise, God would have just told Noah to move. But this is easily addressed by noting that if the earth was filled with violence and corruption, travel for 8 people in a caravan of animals would have been a pretty dangerous thing to do. It would make more sense that if you were already in a safe place, to simply stay put and ride the storm out. Plus, if Noah was acting as a prophet for his generation, he would have had to stay in one place so that he could build the ark, so that could serve as a warning to the surrounding people of the judgment that was coming. Before God sends destruction, he usually sends a prophet to warn the people, so they are without excuse. If Noah just packed up and left the region to a place where the flood would not reach, he would have been unable to proclaim the coming judgment. So constructing the ark is not incompatible with the idea the flood was regional. Another issue arises when we consider ancient beliefs concerning animals. James McGrath notes the idea of spontaneous generation was a generally accepted viewpoint in many cultures up until the time of Pastor, and there are hints of this in early Egyptian myths and possibly in some biblical texts. This is the idea that living creatures arise from organic matter. In other words, ancient people thought the earth generated animals that sprang up from the ground or certain materials. Even in more recent centuries, various scientists thought you could develop recipes from different organic components from which animals would spring into existence from. So for the ancient audience, the idea animals would need to be in the ark for the preservation of the species wasn't necessary. The flood was essentially supposed to be a do-over for creation. The earth had become too corrupt, and so God was basically starting over. And all that was needed to be preserved was the image of God and someone that could continue the line of Adam. But preserving specific bloodlines of animals wasn't necessary. After all, Genesis 2 possibly indicates that God spontaneously generated new creatures from the ground. God could simply do the same thing with the new Adam after the flood. So why were animals even brought onto the ark? I think this might have something to do with the preaching of Noah. Let's remember Kenneth Kitchen notes God had his prophets do drastic things for symbolic purposes in order to grab Israel's attention. Isaiah was instructed to walk around naked for a few years to get the attention of Israel. Jeremiah went around breaking pots. Ezekiel did a number of strange things as well. Prophets often did elaborate and strange acts to symbolically teach an important message. Now let's remember also that ancient cultures viewed the world beyond the cities or civilized areas to be chaotic, impure, and a place of disorder. Nature was constantly contrasted with the cities as a place of disorder and uncleanliness. Yet God instructs Noah to bring animals from such domain into the ark. My suggestion is God was so disgusted by how corrupt and sinful the people had become, he used Noah, like he used later prophets, to give a symbolic message through certain actions. That is, it is better to save the creatures of the chaotic wilderness than to spare the human culture. The construction of the ark and the animals God ordered Noah to save would be a public message to the surrounding culture and future readers that generation had become corrupt and more impure than the chaotic wilderness they detested so much. That God looked at nature as something good and worth saving instead of them. It was the animals and their offspring that would get to live, not the people. To have your offspring live and flourish was considered a blessing, and God granted that to the animals, not to the corrupt generation. Later readers could have expected clean animals to be included for the sake of sacrifice, as indicated by what happened after the flood. But the inclusion of 2 of every wild and unclean animal, in addition to the 7 pairs of every clean animal, could have been used as a symbolic message to the culture of the coming judgment. One could also see a second message in the inclusion of animals. Noah is set up as the new Adam, but part of Adam's task was that of naming and acting as a caretaker of the animals. Animals being brought to Noah would also establish him as the new Adam and represent a divine sign that the new Adam had arrived and that the people should listen to him. It is also indicated in Genesis 9 the covenant God establishes was meant to include the animals, and so they would need to be partakers of the covenantal stipulations, such as entering the ark and being present. So in a nutshell, God indicates his love for nature by including the animals in the covenantal stipulations. The covenant established later in Genesis 9 was meant to include animals, and thus they are brought into the ark, so later readers can see a covenant was made with creation and not just humanity. Again, the text's main focus is on establishing a new covenant with nature, and the text should be read with this cultural idea in mind, not with our own cultural expectations. Some suggest the mention of clean and unclean animals is anachronistic. That is, it reflects later priestly laws concerning the eating of clean animals, which were not in existence before the time of Moses. But this is never indicated by the text. First, it is indicated to Noah after the flood. He can eat any type of animal, not just certain animals designated as clean. And second, the text implies the additional clean animals were necessary for future sacrifices. In other words, extra clean animals were needed for rituals concerning sacrifices to God, not for dietary means. But what of the size of the ark? Based on modern estimates, it would be about 135 meters long, 23 meters wide, and 14 meters high. But this might be a cultural misunderstanding. As we noted in the video on Genesis 5, the early chapters of Genesis employ a base 60 counting system. Likewise, the cubits of Genesis 6 also seem to be dependent on a base 60 system and are idealized formulas within that culture. With this in mind, the ark measurements would not necessarily indicate a gigantic boat, like we see with modern-day replicas. This fits with the cultural context. Andrew George notes special buildings and temples were often described with idealized dimensions and not described by their literal size. He says, the Isangil tablet, formerly understood as offering an accurate physical description of Babylon's ziggurat, has been characterized as a document more interested in abstract ideas than real buildings. This would also make sense with verse 14. The verse contains 3 Akkadian cognates, and given this, scholars have suggested the most reasonable interpretation is make yourself a vessel of stalks from a reed hut. With reeds you will make the vessel, and tar it inside and out with bitumen. It doesn't make sense to suggest an ark 135 meters long was constructed from materials from a reed hut. However, if the measurements are idealized numbers, then the text would be compatible with a much smaller vessel, large enough for a few people and local animals. Noah's preparation would ensure him and his family would be spared, and that a new covenant between God and the living creatures of the earth would be established, but also ensure the corrupt generation was amply warned of the coming judgment, so they were without excuse. What happens next is a remake of the created order that God established under Adam. The floodwaters would come upon the land and wash away the sin of humanity. Hope would survive in the new Adam, and humanity would get its second chance. But more would be needed to eventually deal with sin.